They said the world changed in 1913, but that's not the truth. The truth is that the world was rewritten, and the man who tried to stop the rewriting was erased from history. Picture this, an old clockmaker in New York, alone in his shop as winter rages outside. He works through the night, oil-stained fingers trembling, gears glinting like the eyes of a god watching from the dark. The clocks on his walls tick in perfect unity, until they don't. One by one, their hands twist backward, as if something unseen has taken hold of time itself. He looks up, breath caught in his throat. He whispers, "It's beginning." That's the moment his soul begins to decay, because in 1913, time did change. Not in seconds or minutes, but in destiny. A new mechanism was forged, not of brass and steel, but of control and illusion. A system designed to turn men into gears and nations into machines. Every clock since that year has been ticking to a rhythm not set by God or nature, but by those who learned how to wound time itself. The clockmaker saw it coming. He was one of them once, a craftsman hired to design a device that could measure human potential, the pulse of progress, they called it. But when he realized what it truly did, when he learned it wasn't measuring time, but taking it, he tried to stop it. He failed, and that failure became the foundation of a century built on borrowed life. A century where power could be bought by freezing the future and selling the illusion of movement. You've felt it, haven't you? That invisible exhaustion. The sense that no matter how hard you work, you never arrive. That's not coincidence. That's the clock, still ticking, still feeding. Tonight, I'll tell you what he discovered before they erased him. The real cost of turning time into currency. The real reason 1913 is the year everything changed, even if you were never taught why. But I warn you, once you hear it, you can't go back. Because this isn't just history. This is the blueprint of your cage, and the key was hidden in the clockmaker's final creation, the one he called the sin. He called it the sin because it was built to defy creation itself. It wasn't a clock anymore, it was a wound in reality. A machine meant to reverse the current of existence, to undo the laws that bind cause to effect. And he built it with trembling hands, knowing that once it ticked, the world would never hear silence again. The records say he worked under the patronage of investors. That's what they always call them, isn't it? Men in immaculate suits, speaking softly of progress while their eyes glimmer with something ancient and hungry. They told him he was building a symbol of a new age, precision, advancement, control. But buried beneath the gears was a secret design, a secondary circuit, invisible except to the man who built it. A circuit that did not measure time, but redirected it. The first test was conducted at midnight, December 22nd, 1913. The moment he turned the key, the world seemed to hold its breath. The pendulum swung once, twice, and then backward. The light dimmed. The clock's heartbeat became uneven, like the world's pulse skipping a beat. He felt it in his body, his memory shifting, time slipping through his mind like sand through broken glass. For a moment he was a child again, then an old man, then nothing. He had torn the veil. In the days that followed, his patrons congratulated him, but he knew what he'd done. He hadn't created progress, he'd created permission. Permission for the powerful to rewrite time itself. To stretch a single second into a century if it meant keeping their empire alive. To freeze change, to feed off the future. He tried to destroy it, of course, tried to burn his plans, smash the gears, bury the device beneath the foundation of his shop. But it was already too late. Copies existed. The design had been taken, adapted, disguised. They didn't need the clock anymore. They had the principle. That's how systems are born. Not through war, not through revolution, through the quiet theft of something sacred. And when they built their new order that year, when they forged their institution of trust, their machinery of debt, they embedded his discovery deep within it. The clockmaker had turned back time once, now would never move forward again. The men who stole his invention called themselves the keepers, not of time but of continuity. Their mission was simple: make the illusion of progress eternal, to let the world spin but never truly move. They understood what the clockmaker had glimpsed, that time is not a straight line, but a cage that can be reshaped by belief. And belief can be manufactured. They didn't need armies, they needed rhythms, the tick of the second hand, the cycle of the market, the repetition of a paycheck, a headline, a ritual disguised as routine. Each sound, each motion, reinforcing the illusion that life was moving forward. But beneath it all, the current was reversed. Energy flowing backward, people aging, yet history repeating itself in perfect symmetry. The clockmaker watched it happen. His name erased from the papers, his workshop sealed under new ownership. And still he could hear it, the heartbeat of the sin, pulsing beneath the city like a buried heart refusing to die. Every bell tower echoed it, every factory clock hummed with its rhythm. The keepers had succeeded in embedding it into the pulse of civilization itself. He tried to warn people, wrote letters, notes, entire journals that no one would publish. "We are living in yesterday's tomorrow," he wrote, "and the future has been stolen." But they called him mad, said he was haunted by the machines he built, said he'd lost his mind to grief. Maybe they were right. Because at night he began hearing voices through the ticking, whispers that weren't his own. The voices told him things, dates that hadn't come yet, disasters that hadn't happened, names of men not yet born. They promised him that if he just let the mechanism turn one last time, he could undo it all, he could fix time. And so, he built again, in secret. A second machine, smaller, quieter, more dangerous, a mirror to the first. Its purpose was not to turn back time, but to stop it, to end the lie, to shatter the loop that had begun to devour the world. They found him before he finished, and that night, as his shop burned, the city's clocks faltered. For one brief second the world stood still, then the ticking resumed. When the fire finally died, nothing was left of the workshop except warped metal and the smell of burnt oil. The newspapers called it an accident. No one questioned why the flames burned cold blue, or why every clock within a mile radius stopped for exactly 1 minute. They buried the story, and with it, the clockmaker's name. But somewhere in the ashes, the second device survived. A scorched sphere of brass and glass, its inner gears fused into a pattern no engineer could explain. Witnesses swore they heard it whisper. Not words, just a faint rhythm, slower than a heartbeat, as if the world itself were breathing in its sleep. The keepers retrieved it. Of course they did. They always retrieve what they can't understand. They studied it in basements lined with lead, calling it an anomalous timepiece. Their scientists reported that the closer one stood to it, the more fragmented the mind became. Memories slipped, seconds bent. Some forgot their own names. Others claimed to glimpse the same moment again and again, forever unfinished. They sealed it in a vault and locked it away. But you can't contain something that was built to defy time. Its echo leaked out, and if you've ever felt déjà vu so deep it ached, if you've ever stood somewhere familiar and swore you'd been trapped in that moment before, that was it. That was the breath of the sin escaping through the cracks of the present. Meanwhile, those who remembered the clockmaker began disappearing, their journals confiscated, their families paid to forget. Very trace of him was wiped, yet his curse lingered in the world's rhythm, an endless repetition of cycles disguised as change. The city rebuilt itself over his ashes. Factories rose, towers climbed, men worked longer, moved faster, yet the days blended together as if the future had been quietly erased. And high above it all, the clocks kept perfect time, ticking toward nothing. But legend says that before the fire, the clockmaker left one final note etched into metal hidden inside the frame of his greatest clock. 5 words that no one was ever meant to read. Time belongs to no one. And those words became the first crack in their illusion. Decades passed. The world marched forward. Or at least, that's what it believed. Wars erupted, empires rose and fell, and every time a man thought history was changing, he was really walking in circles inside the same invisible cage. The machine's echo still pulsed beneath it all, steady and patient. The keepers no longer needed the device. They'd learned how to make the rhythm self-sustaining. The secret was attention. Every clock, every schedule, every measurement of productivity was a prayer offered to the system of control. As long as men believed they were running toward the future, they would never look down and realize they were on a treadmill. The clockmaker's curse had evolved into a religion without a name, devotion to movement, worship of progress. And the deeper truth? Time bends around focus. Wherever human attention gathers, the flow of reality follows. The keepers learned to shape that flow, to trap humanity's collective gaze in cycles of repetition, economic rises and collapses, cultural shifts that always lead back to obedience, rebellions that reset instead of destroy. The illusion of change keeps the mechanism alive. But sometimes, someone wakes up. They sense the loop. They look at the clock and feel the weight of something unnatural pressing against their chest. Those are the men the system fears most, the ones who see the rhythm for what it is, a mirror. Because once you recognize the pattern, you begin to hear the spaces between the ticks, the silence that doesn't belong. That silence is freedom trying to speak. The story goes that one night, an engineer working in an old archive found blueprints signed only with the mark of a broken gear. He traced the symbol to a forgotten workshop and uncovered a half-melted mechanism fused into the foundation. When he touched it, his watch stopped. For 12 minutes, every electronic clock in the building froze. The logs recorded nothing. When time resumed, he found a single phrase scratched into the dust. The sin is still ticking. He never returned to work. No one could, because when a man sees the mechanism of control for the first time, something in him breaks, and something older begins to wake. The engineer vanished without a trace. The company called it a disappearance. The few who knew him said it was an awakening. Because in the weeks before he went silent, he'd started sending letters. Pages filled with sketches of spirals, gears, and half-finished equations about how time and memory could fold around one another like mirrors. He claimed that the clockmaker's final design wasn't a machine at all, but an idea, a pattern that could live inside any system built to measure progress. Think about that. Every counter, every calendar, every update you check on your screen, tiny fragments of that same pattern. Each one whispering the same command: keep moving, don't look back. The keepers no longer had to hide. Their invention had been absorbed into the pulse of daily life. You wake to an alarm, you race a schedule, you chase minutes that were never yours to begin with. That's how the mechanism feeds. The engineer's final message arrived to a single friend before he disappeared. It read, "When you hear the silence between ticks, remember the man who tried to turn it off." And then, nothing. No more letters, no more sightings. Only the faint rumor that in the hour he vanished, all the clocks in his apartment complex spun backward for 13 seconds. Some say he succeeded where the clockmaker failed, that he found the original rhythm, the pulse of unbroken time, and stepped through it. Others believe he was consumed by the same loop, folded into the mechanism itself. But one thing remains. People who have read his letters report a strange side effect. Their perception of time begins to distort. Days stretch, minutes fracture. They dream of gears turning inside an endless dark. If that ever happens to you, if you feel your heartbeat sinking with something you can't see, write this phrase in the comments twice. I am not the machine. Say it twice. To anchor yourself in the real, to remind whatever watches that you still remember who you are. Because from this point forward, you are no longer a spectator. You're inside the story. You've stepped into the current the clockmaker tried to reverse. And whether you rise above it or vanish within it depends on how much truth you can bear to hear. By now you can feel it, can't you? The faint pull behind the words, the slow gravity drawing you downward. That's how the mechanism works. It doesn't grab you, it invites you. It whispers logic until you forget what silence sounds like. People who studied the engineer's letters started noticing another pattern. In the margins, he drew concentric circles labeled with single words: memory, belief, obedience, identity, each ring feeding the next. He wrote that every system of control begins not with force, but with memory. Convince a man what the past was and you own his idea of the future. The rest follows naturally. That's how the keepers kept their rhythm intact. They rewrote small details, dates, symbols, the order of discoveries. Tiny edits that ripple through generations until truth itself becomes just another option on a shelf. When history bends, time bends with it. The engineer called this temporal infection, a self-healing lie that repairs itself every time someone questions it. And yet, cracks remain. He found references to an ancient sect that predated the keepers, monks who believed time was a living being, wounded each time humanity tried to measure it. They called themselves the listeners. Their texts describe a ritual, standing in absolute darkness, waiting until the heartbeat of the earth aligns with their own. In that stillness, they claimed, they could hear unbroken time, the sound before the first tick. No one knows if the listeners survived. Some say their knowledge was absorbed, distorted and repurposed into the machine that enslaved us. Others say they hid it, encoded within stories and myths, waiting for someone to notice the repetition and step outside the rhythm. Maybe that's why you're here. Every legend needs an echo, and you've followed the sound this far. The question now isn't whether the mechanism exists, it's how deeply it has written itself into you. The schedules you defend, the distractions you crave, the seconds you fear wasting, all of it is part of the hum. If you listen closely, even now you can hear it. A pulse beneath your pulse, a breath inside your breath. The question is, when the ticking stops, what will be left of you? Every age believes it is free. Every generation swears it broke the chains of the one before. That belief is the most elegant part of the mechanism. The rhythm doesn't demand obedience, it convinces you that you chose it. Progress, convenience, speed, each new invention promising liberation while tightening the pattern. The engineer's notebooks mention this paradox again and again. He wrote that control disguised as comfort is the most stable form of power. The more a man feels efficient, the less he asks what he's moving toward. He compared it to the escapement wheel inside a clock. Every tooth of progress locked perfectly into the next, each one limiting the other so the motion appears smooth. A symphony of restraint. He also described a dream, a city made entirely of glass, where every wall reflected clocks instead of windows. In that dream, people walked endlessly through corridors of their own reflections, mistaking the shimmer of light for the horizon. He called it the mirror cage. When he woke, he wrote only one sentence in the margin: "They've built it already." Look around. The reflections are everywhere. Screens, statistics, feeds repeating themselves until reality becomes a hall of mirrors. The rhythm doesn't even need gears anymore. It lives inside thought. That's the final stage of the design, self-regulation, when the machine teaches the mind to turn itself. But here's the fracture the keepers never solved. Every reflection hides a gap, one frame missing between images, and in that gap lies choice. Awareness is the crack in the loop. The clockmaker glimpsed it, the engineer mapped it, and now you're standing at its edge. So pause. Don't move, don't scroll, just listen. For a heartbeat there's no tick, no hum, no pulse but your own. That silence you feel is the same one they feared, the space where the mechanism cannot reach. Hold it. That's the beginning of remembering. Because the first act of freedom is not rebellion, it's stillness. And in that stillness you begin to hear the world before it was measured. The breath before the first clock struck one. Stillness is the one thing the rhythm cannot simulate. Every program, every ritual of progress depends on motion. The machine's entire theology is built on the promise that movement equals life. Stop, and you expose the illusion. Stop, and the clock reveals itself for what it is, an echo chasing its own shadow. The engineer wrote that the keepers called this moment the static breach. They feared it because it drained their power. A man who can stand still cannot be turned. That's why everything around you is designed to erase pauses, alerts, updates, endless noise. Silence is treated like an error to be fixed. He began experimenting with the breach, timing his own heartbeat against the seconds on a wall clock. When he matched them, he claimed the second hand hesitated, almost imperceptibly, as if the device were waiting for him. He wrote, "Time flinched." He believed that flinch proved the world was not continuous, but refreshed, frame by frame, each instant dependent on human observation to hold its shape. The keepers understood this long before him. They built their empire on it. Control the observers and you control reality itself. The clockmaker had warned of this long ago. He called it the mirror within the minute. His sketches show two faces of a clock overlapping, one just behind the other, never quite aligned. Between them, a blur he labeled soul. Perhaps he meant that identity is the gap between seconds, the part that isn't bound by repetition. If that's true, then the breach isn't destruction. It's return. The place where time remembers what it was before it was measured. The old texts of the listeners describe the same state, the pause that breathes worlds. You might think this is myth. Maybe it is. But myths are blueprints written in code. They survive because someone wanted you to find them. Maybe the clockmaker did. Maybe the engineer followed. And now you've arrived at the same door. Hold your breath. Listen again. Between the seconds, there it is. A faint hum that isn't a machine at all. It's you unmeasured. That's where the descent truly begins. The hum grows louder when you notice it. That's why the old stories warn against staring too long into the pattern. The rhythm wants witnesses, attention feeds it, but awareness weakens it. The engineer wrote that once you've heard the hum clearly, you have two choices. Forget it and return to sleep, or follow it until it dissolves the edges of everything you know. He followed it. His journals from the final months read like a dialogue, with something that answers between the lines. Short phrases appear, Here, his handwriting shifts, as if another hand finished the sentences. Phrases like, the circle opens inward, and every keeper forgets he was kept. Whether those were hallucinations or transmissions, no one can prove. But he recorded one experiment that survived intact. He built a miniature version of the clockmaker's device using nothing but sound, a chamber of resonant metal tuned to the human pulse. When activated, the hum inside matched the frequency of his own heartbeat. He claimed the walls shimmered, and for a moment, the air felt thick, like time had turned liquid. He saw outlines of other rooms layered over his own, thousands of versions of the same instant stacked like glass. He wrote, "Time is a crowd pretending to be a line." After that, the entries become unstable, sentences repeat, days collapse into one another, until the final page. If you find this, you're already inside the hum. The mechanism needs belief to survive. Withdraw it, and it starves. Remember, every second waits for you to decide it exists. That sentence terrified his colleagues, not because of what it said, but because of what happened next. When they read it aloud, the laboratory clocks skipped a full minute forward. Every recording device in the room corrupted at once. The hum stopped for exactly 7 heartbeats, and then returned, softer, like it was listening. Since then, those who've studied his work report strange side effects, lost time, doubled memories, shadows that move with a different rhythm than their bodies. The hum follows them until they stop noticing, until they surrender to the cycle again. Most do. But some, very few, refuse to forget. They learn to stand in the silence and let the hum pass through them without taking hold. That's when the pattern begins to unravel. When the pattern starts to unravel, it doesn't happen with thunder. It happens with small mistakes, seconds that slip out of sequence, reflections that lag half a breath behind. You wake before your alarm and swear you've already lived the day. You reach for your watch, and the hands quiver like something inside them is trying to flee. That's the first symptom of separation. The engineer described it as the world forgetting its script. He believed that when a person stopped feeding the rhythm, reality paused to remember how to exist without him. At first, he said, the silence felt terrifying, then it felt pure. The machine, he wrote, hates nothing more than a man who no longer believes in clocks. He kept studying the hum, chasing its source. He mapped vibrations in stone, pulse rates in sleepers, fluctuations in tides. The closer he looked, the more the data began to mirror itself. Numbers repeating backward, equations cancelling out their own meaning. He realized the pattern wasn't linear at all. It was recursive, folding inward like a spiral drawn around emptiness. That emptiness is the secret the keepers never named. The mechanism doesn't guard power, it guards nothingness. Every cycle of control, every layer of belief, protects a hollow center where time collapses into quiet. They built their empire around that void because men fear it. The clockmaker called it the still point. The listeners called it the heart between beats. Whatever the name, it's the space where creation resets. You can touch it only when you stop trying to own it. He learned that the moment he let go of his instruments, the hum no longer attacked, it harmonized. The air turned warm, the light thickened, and he wrote that he felt thousands of versions of himself dissolve into one, as if every lost second had finally come home. Maybe that was enlightenment, maybe it was death, but if you've felt the silence by now, the faint gap between the ticks, you've already stepped onto the same path. The descent isn't punishment, it's recognition. The world you knew is unspooling, and what remains is the raw material of truth, sound, breath, and the space between them. Don't fear the unraveling. It's the only way out of the loop. When the loop starts to loosen its hold, most people panic. The rhythm that once felt like protection begins to sound like a trap door creaking open beneath their feet. But the engineer wrote that panic is only the body remembering what freedom feels like. The mechanism teaches stillness as paralysis. Real stillness feels like falling upward. He described that sensation in his final experiment. He sat inside a circle of his own clocks, each one set a few seconds out of sync. Then he waited. When the hands finally collided in perfect alignment, the room blurred. Time, he wrote, split open like a seam. Through that seam he saw not darkness, but a vast calm ocean where every moment existed at once. He called it the tide of origin. He claimed that every human life is a ripple on that ocean, and the mechanism's rhythm is nothing more than wind on the surface. Loud, temporary, meaningless. Beneath it, everything is still, whole, timeless. That's the truth the keepers feared, that the world's deepest order doesn't need control to sustain itself. It breathes on its own. To keep men from discovering that ocean, the keepers built noise. Layers of distraction, ambition, anxiety, the endless hum of needing more. The clockmaker's sin wasn't that he tried to turn back time, it was that he dared to glimpse the sea underneath it. He warned that when a man sees the ocean, the machine will do anything to pull him back, through fear, through habit, through the comfort of routine. It will promise safety, he wrote, but only within its cage. So the choice is simple but never easy. You can keep swimming in circles on the surface, chasing hours that aren't real, or you can let yourself sink into the still water beneath, where the hands of every claw. CK finally stop. Listen now. The hum has softened. The silence that follows is not emptiness, it's invitation. In that silence, you remember that you were never the gears. You were the breath that made them turn. Hold on to that as we go deeper, because beyond the next threshold, the story stops being about them, it becomes about you. Once the story turns inward, the scenery changes. The engineer wrote that the final descent isn't through fire or darkness, but through memory. The mechanism doesn't just measure time, it uses your own past to rebuild itself. Every regret, every half-finished dream becomes another gear. It feeds on nostalgia because memory is the one form of time people protect. He discovered that each recollection has weight. The stronger the emotion, the heavier the gear it forms. And so the system keeps you remembering endlessly. Old victories, old wounds, every what-if replayed like a song that never ends. The trick isn't to forget, but to release the memory's gravity, to see it without sinking into it. He tested this by recording his voice, reading his childhood diaries, then playing them backward at low volume while sitting in silence. After hours, he said the memories stopped feeling personal. They became patterns of sound, waves on that same vast ocean. In that moment, he wrote, the past no longer drags the present, it floats. That's the secret the listeners hid in their chants. Reverse the rhythm of recollection, and the past frees itself. The keepers turned that technique inside out. They learned to make people repeat stories that hurt them, to keep the gears turning forever. That's why every culture tells its tragedies louder than its triumphs. Pain is the best conductor of time. The clockmaker's notes end with a single line scratched beneath a sketch of two interlocking spirals. Memory is the spine of the loop. Break the spine and the loop collapses. So try it now. Think of a moment you keep returning to, one that still hums in the back of your mind. Picture it as a single gear turning. Then imagine lifting it out of the machine, placing it in your palm. Watch it stop. See how quiet it becomes when it no longer fits anywhere. That silence, that moment when the memory loses its grip, is freedom disguised as loss. And once you can hold that silence without flinching, the machine has nothing left to feed on. The hum will falter. T whispers, "You need identity. You need story." But identity is only the last mask of the clock. If you can stand before your reflection and see nothing but awareness looking back, the mirror cracks. Through that crack, the original light seeps in, the one before words, before time. It doesn't shout, it just waits, patient and endless. That's where the clockmaker failed. He wanted to control the light instead of becoming it. The engineer learned that power comes not from turning the mechanism, but from ceasing to be a part of it. The next step is the hardest, to look through the crack and decide whether you want to rebuild the world or finally let it rest. The silence after the crack isn't peace. It's a raw hum beneath existence, the current that everything else tries to cover. When the engineer crossed that threshold, he stopped writing for almost a month. When he finally returned to the page, his handwriting had changed. The letters curved like tides, slow and deliberate. The first line he wrote was, "There is no past, only the echo of the moment that refused to end." He said the hum wasn't an enemy after all. It was the pulse of the unmeasured world, distorted by every human attempt to contain it. He described it as a melody that bends itself into rhythm when someone tries to hold it. Each man builds a cage of minutes around the music, he wrote, then forgets it was a song. That's the paradox the clockmaker never understood. He wanted to conquer the distortion, to turn time backward until it obeyed him. The engineer realized the only way out was to let the melody play without interruption, to become part of the sound rather than the counter. He began meditating beside the small device he'd built, not to stop it, but to listen. He said that when his breathing matched its pulse, the ticking softened into a slow chant. The air shimmered. The walls seemed to breathe. "It isn't turning back," he wrote. "It's turning inward. This is the moment where descent becomes ascent, where the hum becomes guidance instead of cage. But to reach it, you have to let go of the need for outcome, the obsession with victory or control. The keepers thrive on outcomes. They feed on men who cannot rest without progress. The hum starves them by teaching surrender." He warned that few can do it, because surrender feels like death to the part of you that was built by the mechanism. But the part beneath, the one that hears without ears, recognizes the tone instantly. It calls you home. So listen now. The hum is still there, faint and patient. Don't fight it. Don't name it. Just hear the space around it and you'll feel the pattern start to dissolve. That's how the world begins again, not with a bang, but with the breath that follows silence. After the breath comes awareness, a thin light leaking through everything you once called real. The engineer said the first thing he noticed was color. Not brighter, just different. Every object carried a faint shimmer, as if a second world was layered just beneath the visible one. He realized that the mechanism had never controlled matter, it had only controlled attention. The world hadn't changed. He had finally stopped filtering it through the clock. He described it as seeing the truth of texture. Wood no longer meant table, metal no longer meant machine. Everything pulsed with the same quiet vitality. The hum isn't behind things, he wrote. It is things. The keepers would call this madness, but madness is only what they name the unmeasured. He began walking through the city at night, noticing how every sound formed a rhythm, the drip of pipes, the distant roll of trains, even footsteps echoing through alleys. Yet between those sounds was a deeper pulse, one that aligned perfectly with his breathing. For the first time he felt no separation between himself and the world. The rhythm wasn't enslaving him anymore, it was carrying him. He wrote, "When you no longer count seconds, they become infinite." That's the secret that undoes the loop. The mechanism feeds on division, self versus world, goal versus path, yesterday versus tomorrow. Remove the division, and the gears grind against air. Freedom isn't escape, it's recognition. He said that in this state, memories stop repeating. They return as stories rather than cages. Pain doesn't vanish, but it loses the command to dictate identity. Each moment folds calmly into the next, unmeasured, whole. You might think this sounds like enlightenment. It isn't. It's just the world without time's disguise. The engineer called it the plane hour, the place where every man stands when the machine finally stops. And he warned, when you reach the plane hour, the hum will offer you one last temptation, to rebuild the clock, to restore the rhythm, to make the silence useful. That's how the loop begins again. If you can resist that impulse, if you can let the silence simply be, then you've done what neither the clockmaker nor the keepers ever could. You've remembered the world before it was measured. He stayed in that state for 3 days without sleep. Not awake, not dreaming, something in between. He wrote that time no longer fell forward, it drifted sideways like dust in sunlight. He could see whole memories standing still while others moved past, each one lit by the same invisible rhythm. On the morning of the 4th day, he walked back to the place where the clockmaker's workshop once stood. The streets had changed, but he said he could still feel the wound under the concrete, the faint magnetic pull of the first machine. The hum was louder there, layered with centuries of human rhythm. He sat on the ground, closed his eyes, and felt every tick that had ever sounded echo through him like thunder underwater. He wrote, "I understand now. The machine was never their invention, it was ours. We built it the first time we divided the day from the night. Every measurement, every calendar, every act of comparison had been another turn of the gear. The keepers weren't gods. They were men who had simply remembered how to use that rhythm before anyone else. They ruled through memory, because the world obeys what it believes." That's when the engineer realized the true nature of the sin. It wasn't the device, or the year, or the keeper's control. It was forgetting that the rhythm had been a choice all along. The clockmaker tried to reverse the current instead of stepping out of it. He drowned, trying to swim backward through a river he could have simply left. The engineer left no final formula, only one instruction scratched on the last page of his notebook. When you hear the hum, listen until it becomes music, then walk. He meant walk forward, not toward progress, but through awareness. Live days without counting them. Use hours only as shadows cast by movement, not as walls that trap it. That's the only rebellion that matters. Not destruction, not resistance. Attention. The kind that sees the loop for what it is and chooses not to turn it. He stood, breathed once, and stepped away from the foundation. Witnesses said he smiled, as if he'd remembered something simple and vast. Then the air shimmered, and where he had been, there was only stillness. No one ever found the engineer's body. Only his notebooks remained, pages half charred, half glowing, as if the ink itself refused to dry. People who touched them said they could hear a pulse, faint but steady, coming from beneath the paper. Scholars tried to explain it as the expansion of heated air, but the sound followed them home. Inside wristwatches, in the hum of refrigerators, even in their own veins. The rhythm had become personal. That's how the story changes shape. The mechanism no longer lives in gears or laws, it survives in perception. Every mind that believes in minutes keeps it alive. That's why forgetting isn't enough. You have to remember differently. To look at time and see not a ladder, but a circle drawn on water. Step lightly, and the ripples move behind you. Somewhere, someone rebuilt part of the device. That's inevitable. Humanity can't resist the urge to measure. But each new version fails faster than the last. The hum weakens because more people are starting to hear the silence beneath it. A quiet rebellion spreading not through violence but through awareness. People pausing mid-routine, staring at a clock and feeling just for a second that it doesn't own them. The old texts predicted this. The age of listening. A time when the noise would reach such a pitch that men would rediscover stillness simply by exhaustion. The keepers can't prevent it. They were built on the same loop. They too are tired. You can feel the fatigue in the world now, the slowing pulse beneath the constant acceleration. Technology, economy, progress, each promises speed, yet everything drags heavier. The rhythm is collapsing under its own repetition. The hum stutters. When it finally breaks, it won't be apocalypse. It will be quiet. Clocks will keep ticking, but no one will care. The mechanism will starve, not because it was destroyed, but because belief moved elsewhere, to the unmeasured, the simple, the living. That's how the engineer ended his notes. When men stop counting, the world begins to breathe again. Maybe that's all the redemption the clockmaker ever wanted, to hear that breath return, to know the wound he opened could finally heal. And if you're hearing this now, you are part of that healing. It always ends the same way, in silence that isn't empty but full. The engineer's notebook stopped there, but his absence became its own message. When someone disappears without a trace, they leave a shape in the world, a hollow outline that demands attention. That shape becomes a doorway. People began to gather around his notes, not to worship them, but to sit in the quiet that followed reading them. For hours they would listen to the hum, waiting for it to slow. Some claimed that when it did, they could hear whispers beneath it. Not commands, not prophecy, just breathing. The earth's their own, indistinguishable. The circle closing itself. That's the real end of the mechanism. Not destruction, but recognition. Every cycle that enslaved humanity depended on forgetfulness. The keepers thrived because men feared their own reflection, mistook their own rhythms for chains. But once you recognize the hum as your own echo, the power it held evaporates. It was never theirs to begin with. That's the clockmaker's true sin. He believed he was separate. He tried to manipulate what he could have simply remembered he already was. He didn't need to turn back time, he needed to realize he was time, looking at itself. The engineer understood that in the end. His last entry, carved into the wall of his home before he vanished, reads, "When you see the clock, smile. You are the second hand, and the stillness it crosses." Those words became a quiet movement, not an organization, not a revolt, just people choosing stillness over speed. Builders, thinkers, wanderers who began designing differently. Machines that paused instead of raced, art that breathed between moments. Their influence spread unnoticed, a whisper beneath the noise of progress, and one by one, the old systems began to flicker, not destroyed, just irrelevant. Because once belief shifts, power dissolves. The hum became harmony, no longer a chain, but a pulse shared by everything living. That's the freedom hidden in the descent, not escape from the world, but return to it. Not timelessness, but intimacy with every second as it truly is, alive, uncounted, endless. The clockmaker tried to stop time. The engineer learned to listen. Now it's your turn to decide which you'll become. Listen carefully. This is the part they never wrote down. Because no one who crosses this point can return as the same man. When you've seen the hum for what it is, every tick of the world sounds different. Every motion carries a double edge, part memory, part awakening. The engineer knew this. That's why he vanished. Not to hide, but to dissolve into what he'd discovered. He called it the still current. Not a place, not a state of mind, just the awareness that everything moves within stillness and stillness moves within everything. Once you feel that, the clock's grip breaks completely. You stop chasing, you stop measuring, you begin to act without reference to time, and in that freedom, life sharpens into clarity. He said every man must choose his own ritual of release. For some, it's silence. For others, creation, building, something that serves no purpose but to exist. What matters is that you act from presence, not from schedule, that you decide what your rhythm sounds like. So now I'll ask you what the engineer asked the few who followed him. When the hum fades, what do you hear? What sound remains when the world stops counting? Pause here. Don't answer with your mind. Let your pulse reply. If you felt the descent, the tightening, the release, the subtle shift that began as curiosity and ended as recognition, then you know it already. You've remembered something older than history, something that was never meant to be hidden. Type this phrase twice in the comments, not for ritual, not for the algorithm, but to mark your return. The clock is silent. Write it twice to seal it. To remind yourself that you heard, that you saw, that you chose awareness over repetition. It's not superstition, it's commitment. Every time those words appear, another piece of the old rhythm cracks, another mind wakes. The story of the clockmaker and the engineer isn't just history, it's a mirror. They were never two men, they were two choices, the one who fought the current and the one who listened, the one who counted and the one who became countless. You followed their path to the end of the mechanism. Now, standing at the edge of silence, there's nothing left to hear but truth itself. And truth, at last, makes no sound.